Ladies and gentlemen, as you heard at the end, before you were dismissed yesterday, the state has rested its case. Therefore, it is the defendant's opportunity to now present her case. And therefore, I'm going to ask Mr. Bradley if he would proceed.
Actually, Judge, our first witness will be directed by Mr. Marine.
Oh, thank you.
For the record, Judge.
Thank you.
Raise your hand. For the testimony, not beginning with the whole thing.
I do.
May I proceed, Judge?
Yes, you may. Please do.
First of all, good morning.
Good morning.
Sir, kindly state your full name, spell your last.
Sure, my name is Dr. Kent Harshbarger, Harshbarger.
Dr. Harshbarger, what do you do for a living?
I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I currently am the elected official of Montgomery County Coroner, which is Dayton, Ohio.
Beyond Montgomery County, how many other counties do you serve as doing forensic pathology in the state of Ohio?
As an office, the Montgomery County Coroner's Office is a regional forensic center. We serve, depending on one other county, because they also are a regional center, and we get their overflow between 30-ish, 33 and 40 counties. There's 88 counties in Ohio.
Do you ever get any rest?
Not much. I have a very well adequate staff.
Doctor, I want to, in a general sense, what does it mean to be the Montgomery County Coroner? What do you do?
Well, the coroner in general is responsible for designing, implementing, administrating the death investigation system for their jurisdiction, their county. Or Montgomery County also has the regional component, which I manage. Manage personnel, manage budgets. Ultimately, in Ohio, the coroner has to be a physician, either MD or DO. That's one of the requirements for Ohio. You do not need to be a forensic pathologist, that I happen to also be. So I also do autopsy. I do them for Montgomery County, although less now that I've been the coroner, and I do it in a private setting or private practice. So I do multiple autopsies in Ohio. I work in Indiana. I used to cover Kentucky as well, parts of Kentucky.
Doctor, I'm going to go through your qualifications, and I'm going to violate a rule that my mother once told me, and that is don't praise yourself. But I think it's important that we talk about your educational background, your job experience, your degrees, your writings.
Yes, sir.
Certain. All right. Let's start out with your employment history.
Sure.
If you would be so kind, can you detail that for the jury?
Sure. Well, I was appointed the coroner of Montgomery County in September of 2011. I've been the coroner since, still in today. Prior to 2011, I was a deputy coroner. I also ran the office operations. I started that position in November of 2002 through that September of 2011 when my predecessor retired. Prior to 2002, I had worked in a private practice in Central Illinois, covering actually the majority of Central Illinois, doing cases, forensic pathology. I also, in my employment history, am a recently retired Army reservist for 36 years of service, where I was assigned to the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Office. Was a consultant for many years at the Dayton Veterans Hospital in their pathology lab, mainly doing autopsy pathology, but also surgical gross pathology or dissection of the gross tissue. I think so I still have my private practice, and my final employment is I'm currently titled as the Chief Forensic Officer for the Ohio State Coroners Association.
What does that mean, Chief Forensic Officer?
Mostly it means it's the complaint department, but I also am responsible for training new coroners that are out of cycle. So Ohio law requires a newly elected coroner to have certain hours of training. If they're appointed, like I was, out of cycle, I provide that training. I'm available for consulting for any coroner who has questions. I backfill many coroners when they're on vacation. I backfill for signing death certificates if the coroner's unavailable. I talk to families, participate with the board, and then also function with the association in sort of not really a lobbying capacity, but consulting with legislators on proposed law changes.
I want to move to your education. And I want to start with your undergraduate studies.
Okay.
Where, when, and what degree?
Well, I graduated high school in '84, and I started at a junior college in electrical engineering and was less successful at that venture and took a couple years off when I joined the military. Went back in '86 to Southern Illinois University, where from '86 to '90, I got my Bachelor of Arts degree in physiology with minors in biochemistry and psychology. So I graduated that in 1990 as my undergrad.
And how about your medical school training?
Sure. So after college, I attended Southern Illinois University School of Law from 90 to 92. From 92 to 96, I attended Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. In 96, I graduated with my law degree and my medical degree. It's technically a combined program, so when I started, that was designed to get both degrees. That was my medical education and law school.
And explain to us why a medical doctor would get a law degree.
Well, this was the mid-'80s when medicine was changing with a new thing called HMOs, and many doctors were not happy with potential futures of medicine. And I had an opportunity with college I went to. Their combined MD-JD program I was the second class, so essentially applying during the first class. I was smart enough to know that I went from an application pool of several hundred people for 70 slots to an application pool of 2, and we both got in. So one was potential job careers. I was, at the time, interested in forensic pathology. I started college with a minor in administration of justice. I was going to be a police officer, an Illinois State Trooper at the time. So finding forensic pathology, I knew that's a likely destination for me. So the law degree combined program made sense at the time. For career-wise, medicine changed, had another professional degree, and it combined with forensic pathology, at least from a knowledge sense.
And to deviate for a moment, has that law degree been instrumental in your service as a board certified county coroner?
Yes, but I don't know, because I have it, I don't know the opposite side. And I've used it for teaching. I present medical evidence lectures to our prosecutor's office, other venues. I don't practice law. I don't pretend to practice law, but it does allow some greater familiarity, maybe, and knowledge of what is needed for the system.
I'd like to talk about your residency and any fellowships, intern? Can you talk about that?
Sure. I graduated, as I said, in 1996, and then I attended an anatomic and clinical pathology residency program in Muncie, Indiana at Ball Memorial Hospital. I graduated in 2000. And then I attended my fellowship in forensic pathology, which was at the Montgomery County Coroner's Office in Dayton, Ohio, where I currently work. So that's my fellowship.
Have you held any teaching positions?
Yes, some of my teaching positions are at Wright State and Ohio University, their specialty college of medicine, Wright State's College of Medicine. I am an associate assistant professor, which basically means you're a volunteer. And I have taught the renal pathology course. I've done some neurodegenerative courses to the med students, but mainly our function is having residents or med students from those schools rotate through our autopsy service in our office. So most of my teaching is done at the autopsy table with med students or residents.
Doctor, I note that you also have a master's degree.
Yes. So I was recruited back to the Montgomery County Coroner's Office in Dayton, and as I said, in November of 2002, with the intent of becoming the coroner or recruiting back to become the coroner. Dr. Davis, my predecessor, was going to retire in 2004. He retired in 2011. So in that meantime, I knew it was coming. So the administrative duties were coming. So I felt I clearly enjoy education. So I did go back and get my master's of business administration from Wright State University, 2006 to 2011.
Okay. I want to talk about board certification. What is that?
In a general sense, board certification is simply a third party or an outside entity that creates verifiable standards or milestones that one has to get, and then ultimately pass an exam that they create and certify that, and then they declare you're board certified according, because you've met their requirements.
Are you board certified in any specialty?
I am board certified in what's called anatomic and clinical pathology, as well as forensic pathology.
So 3 separate board certificates.
Essentially, yes, but it's a little bit more complicated because pathology has anatomic pathology as a standalone board, clinical pathology as a standalone board, and then they have a combined anatomic and pathology. So while it could be 3, mine is anatomic clinical combined. So it's really 2 boards because I didn't do them separately. So it's technical, but it's really 2 boards because anatomic clinical is combined.
How about licensure?
Yes, I am.
Are you licensed to practice medicine?
Sure. Currently licensed in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana.
I'd like to move on to professional appointments and administrative committees. Can we do that?
Yes, sir.
I know that you are a chairman of a ethics committee.
Since 2013, I have been a member or the chairman of the National Association of Medical Examiners Ethics Committee. Yes.
And what about affiliation with the National Association of Medical Examiners?
I am currently a sitting board member. Recently, as of last year, was on the executive committee. Been on multiple committees for that organization and current fellow.
And have you been appointed to any committee by the governor of the state of Ohio?
I have, and I'm going to forget the name. I'm trying to scan through it. The Working Group for Review of the Medical Board's Handling of the Investigation of Dr. Richard Strauss. I sit on that committee of the Ohio State team position of recent news. I sat on that committee, which basically was brought together to review the policies as related to the Medical Board of Ohio and how their procedures failed or did not fail in that process.
How about an affiliation with the Indiana University School of Medicine?
I have had affiliations with the Indiana University School of Medicine. I don't currently have that.
But in what capacity?
In the, I don't recall that. I was a trustee for the Indiana Medical Society as a resident, and I've been president of the resident section of that. I've been president of the American College of Legal Medicine, but I don't know the Indiana.
Being the president of the American College of Legal Medicine, what does that mean?
So the American College of Legal Medicine is a national organization similar to what we just talked about with the National Association of Medical Examiners. It's a national group, and of note, it is exclusively attorney physicians. So MD, JDs with some ancillary membership, but it's all physician attorneys. And I served in multiple positions and then eventually was elected president of that organization.
Have you had an occasion during the course of your professional endeavors to engage or be a spokesperson for presentations and or lectures relative to your specialty of forensic pathology?
Yes, I have. And I did find the Indiana School of Medicine where I was a faculty member for a brief period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I've done multiple invited lectures or presentations.
Can you take a look at, in reference, your CV that's in front of you and just briefly tell us where you have provided lectures and presentations?
Nationally, I've given presentations, the National Institute of Forensic Technology Institute of Excellence in Washington, D.C., Attorney Association meetings, Ohio Society of Interventional Pain Medicine meetings, medical schools, prosecutors' offices, funeral home and embalming organizations, Miami Valley EMS or multiple EMS symposiums, Children's Hospital Pediatric Trauma Symposiums, multiple grand rounds presentations, Dayton Metropolitan Honor Seminars, our tissue banks presentations, Coroners Association meeting presentations, FBI evidence response team training classes, Association of Tissue Banks, that was in California, presentation. Everything else looks like it's becoming redundant. I did University of Dayton has seminars where I've been asked to present.
In your capacity as the Montgomery County coroner, have you had an occasion to work extensively with county prosecutors?
Of course, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, that's obviously that role is supporting their office with death investigations.
What about publications? Can you just briefly tell us where you've been published and regarding what?
Sure. Many of my publications are as a resident, with a few coming afterwards, but we did a research paper which was published in the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology magazine called Legal Medicine. The two of those articles have been published in the Annals of Diagnostic Pathology, Diagnostic Cytopathology, had platform presentations at various meetings. I authored some, they're called continuing education programs that the College of American Pathologists produces. So basically case studies that pathologists use and answer questions to get education credits. We've done some papers in the Journal of Analytical Toxicology, Journal of Legal Medicine that were mostly book review sections.
Doctor, how many autopsies have you performed in your career?
Obviously not perfectly kept track, but over 5,000.
How many autopsies have you performed in your career as it relates to infants?
Again, not perfect records, 100, 125, somewhere that kind of range.
Have you been called upon as the Montgomery County coroner to make determinations of live birth?
Yes, sir.
How is it that you got involved in this case?
Phone call or letter of correspondence. I don't really remember which one, but I believe your co-counsel reached out to me to be involved.
Okay. And does the fact that you have been engaged as a defense expert create any ethical issues for you whatsoever?
No, it's our job as forensic pathologists is the science-based professional, not we're here to help educate and use our skill set for these purposes. I don't decide that I'm working for at the time is irrelevant. It's my opinion wouldn't differ.
As it relates to this case, were you provided with certain documents, photographs, and or other evidence?
Yes, sir.
And who provided you with that information?
Your co-counsel or the office provided.
Can you tell us what it is that you've reviewed and analyzed in connection with this case?
Certainly. The coroner's report, which assumes many documents, but some brief investigative information, an autopsy report, toxicology report, x-ray reports, from the Geauga County Coroner's Office, scene and body photographs of how the remains were found, and then at autopsy. And then I also examined the microscopic tissue slides themselves at the Geauga Medical Examiner's Office. It's at Coroner's Office. Medical.
Doctor, have you had an occasion during the course of your professional endeavors to testify
Yes,
in
sir.
a courtroom?
Yes, sir.
On how many occasions?
I have raised my estimates over time. It's over 100 now, but I don't have an exact figure.
Have you been declared an expert in your field?
Yes.
And have you been deemed to be of significant expertise such that you were able to render opinions in a courtroom?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would respectfully request that the court deem Dr. Harshbarger as an expert so I can begin eliciting his opinion.
Does the state have any comment?
No,
So granted.
Thank you. So, Doctor, you've identified those items that you reviewed in connection with the services that you have provided in this case.
Yes, sir.
And have you been able to opine whether or not this was a live birth?
I have not been able to apply.
Why not?
So that's a long answer. Because the data available does not support using limited information, i.e. microscopic evaluation of the lungs, as a determinant or the sole determinant for live birth or evidence of essentially voluntary muscle movement, which the breathing is the marker that you were able to expand your chest. The only real markers of that are food in the stomach, although that can be faked as well. But if a child has eaten, then you know they can coordinate their muscles and swallow food. So breathing, having expanded alveoli microscopically, in my opinion, is useful data point, but it is unreliable when all the other markers we use or other markers we typically have available to us allow for greater confidence by doing that. So in my opinion, there's just not enough information on top of postmortem changes that have occurred, which prevent reliability from that microscopic evaluation as really the sole data point we have. And I think it's just too unreliable to make that conclusion.
Is there any way with the information that you've been provided in this case that you could comfortably, professionally, ethically tell us to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether this was a live birth or not?
I could not do that. And I don't do that. It's not my opinion.
We're going to get to talking about this case, but I want to talk to you about your research that you did, medical research, as it relates to this case.
Certainly.
Tell us what you have done.
Obviously, I read chapters again, textbook, forensic books, and I, as we all do, get on Google and, search for articles. And there's some recent articles, and it's actually from the Academic Forensic Pathology, which is a publication of the National Association of Medical Examiners at this time. So it's a review article basically on that topic. Was the baby born alive and how that evaluation can take place. Also an article called Macroscopic and Microscopic Findings of an Infant Lung in Cases of Live or Stillbirth. So combined with those, and the articles cite the textbooks as well, where those articles describe known cases where a baby is stillborn having expanded alveoli, known cases of live birth where the microscopic evaluation of the lungs have atelectic or collapsed alveoli. While it is relevant to the discussion, it's not enough data because it can go either way. If you have known stillbirth with expanded alveoli and known live birth with collapsed alveoli, then because in the environment of forensic pathology, we don't know the starting point, correct? We don't know. We're having to make assumptions. Assumptions is probably the wrong word. We're making interpretations based on the data we have. The data is known to cross over. It's not uniform in that an expanded alveoli means air was voluntarily passing back and forth through the baby's independent action from mom. There are artificial means by which the alveoli can be expanded histologically. The main one is resuscitation, so air being forced into the lungs during attempted life-saving measures. The second main category is decomposition, so other things producing air that expand the lung. If those are not present, then the microscopic evaluation becomes more confident. If those are present, then the microscopic examination becomes equivocal, or just a data point that you then look at other data points. This case, we just don't have some other data points, but we don't have many data points other than the lung histology. And in my opinion, that's not enough to conclude reasonably scientific certainty that a live birth occurred.
Now, you studied the autopsy protocol that
Yep.
was authored by Dr. Challenger back in 1993.
Yes, sir.
Did you scrutinize that protocol?
Yes.
Did you find there to be mistakes in the findings in that protocol as it relates to, let's start with the adrenal glands?
Yes. Though
Tell the jury about that.
so an autopsy, I'm sure you've heard, is done with the external exam, internal exam, where the organs are evaluated. In this protocol, there are multiple areas of the body absent, and they are described, stomach, gastrointestinal, the colon, bowel, small bowel, pancreas, kidneys, adrenal gland, the left arm, right leg are all absent. Ribs are missing. Left lung is missing. So one of those described as absent is the adrenal glands. However, in the microscopic description section, there is a description of the adrenal glands in the microscopic. So I'm not mistaken with, it's internally inconsistent. It's possible that the tissue was found later, but it's internally inconsistent if the adrenal glands were absent, yet they're described microscopically.
Have you looked at the autopsy photographs?
I have, yes.
Doctor, I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 9 through 14.
Yes, sir.
And I'm going to ask you to kindly review those and tell us if you've had an occasion previous to today's proceedings to have reviewed those.
I have these are the photographs I've reviewed as part of my analysis.
Can we publish, for purposes of this segment of his examination, so that the jury can see what the doctor is referencing?
The exhibits you just referenced.
Precisely.
Sure.
While yes, I am technologically deficient. Doctor, this is State's Exhibit 9, I believe.
Yes, sir. It is.
What can you tell us from that photograph?
Infant, obviously, here. There's been post-mortem mutilation, and as some of the trauma we just talked about, or artifact, not trauma, but artifactual changes are present in this exam. I would have preferred a scale. There's no height, there's no length mentioned. Obviously, it would not be very accurate in these remains, but there is no recording of a foot length or length of the body, which is helpful in determining gestational age.
Can you tell us anything from the examination of that photograph that would support the determination of live birth versus stillbirth?
No, not from this exhibit. And further, I believe this exhibit shows, particularly of the head, the leg, maybe the umbilical cord stump, the internal soft tissues of the chest. You see the muscle is a darker gray. That decomposition is occurring, which then gives you a source of gas production, which is a source of expansion of the alveoli artifactually.
I'd ask you to reference your attention to State's Exhibit 10. And from the examination of that photograph, what can you tell us?
Similar observations, particularly of the internal tissues, very autolyzed. I believe it's the left leg present and right arm, but above the lower extremity, right where the pointer is now, very gray, greenish tissue. So again, indicative of some degree of decomposition and therefore source of air. Obviously, internal organs are absent, which in the evaluation of a live birth and stillbirth, what becomes significant is one, those measurements, gestational age, could the infant have survived outside the womb? And second, are there any risk factors which would support intrauterine death or death during labor? So is there a congenital anomaly? Is there infectious organism? Is the placenta normal? Is it infected? Is there a long cord, or was there a cord accident? All those things, because we're missing significant parts of the tissue, in my mind, reduce your confidence level when opining on expansion of lung alveoli, because you don't know many other variables that potentially existed.
Now, just looking at the head of the infant, can you tell us how far along the child was in its development?
No is the correct answer. Is it appearing later in term? Yes. I don't know how many weeks, but the weight supports that as well as being at least the potential of a viable infant outside mother's womb by size. What's most significant in my mind of this photograph and the head itself is it doesn't show maceration, which is one of the things you consider when live birth versus stillbirth is, did the baby die in utero and then has a decomposition type change, which is maceration, which is a sterile sort of autolysis or breakdown of the body, and the brain, the head, and the sutures can begin to overlap. There's a much darker red appearance. So to me, there's evidence that the baby is not macerating. So it's not a long-term intrauterine change. Doesn't mean it wasn't dead in utero. It's just not long-term, days, so to speak.
Can you now reference your attention to State's Exhibit 11?
Yes, sir.
Looking at the baby's face, can you tell us anything about how far along the baby was in its development?
Same answer. Again, technically no, although it is farther along in term. You need really the measurements to decide. And this photo does show some suture overlap because we know during the later exam, the brain is essentially autolyzed or no longer really meaningful. The exam is no longer meaningful due to decomposition changes. And that's evident as the skull is basically contracting over itself because the internal tissues are lost. you can't really tell age with any kind of detail from this picture, other than it is most consistent with viability, which is 20 weeks, but is it 30 weeks or 40 weeks or 45 weeks? You can't tell from the photograph.
And regarding the ability to be able to opine with a reasonable degree of medical certainty the infant's development, why would that issue have relevance in determining whether it was a live birth or a stolen?
Well, there's a foundational question that must be answered, and a live birth is defined as the extrusion of the products of conception and independent of the mother. So only appropriately gestational age infants, fetuses, can survive outside the mother regardless of what. So, and we use 20 weeks-ish. Some countries use 24 weeks. Some countries use 28 weeks to define when that period of time is. So that's a foundational question the pathologist must answer is this even possible to sustain life independent of mother? So that just the gestational age becomes significant along with those measurements that we talked about that weren't provided, partly because of the mutilation. I'm not necessarily being overly critical. I'm just the data points aren't here. And then finally, by using those measurements and having an idea of the gestational age, it's useful in predicting other risk factors. For instance, when you do the weight of this child against the charts, it's 31 weeks in the 10th percentile, I think 35 weeks in the 90th percentile. Clearly there's tissue missing. Clearly that baby was heavier than that, putting it closer to full term by numbers. But we don't know if the baby is actually 32 weeks and in a range of a 40-week baby. So then it's growing too fast. Does the mother have gestational diabetes? Other things that now the placenta is not sufficient to maintain that life independent, not independent, but in utero, particularly during the process of labor. So the gestational age question becomes relevant in assigning risk or tiers of confidence when you're putting the whole story together. And because we don't have that information, it reduces, in my opinion, the ability to say to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, just the heir or the expansion of ELI is a live birth.
Doctor, can we move on to the next state's exhibit, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is 12?
Yes, sir. It is 12.
What can you tell us from that photograph?
The purpose of this is really not much. The umbilical stump is autolyzing, deteriorating, but the photograph is there to indicate that it's torn. It hasn't been cut. It's not a smooth line. Obviously, there's decomposition and animal predation that's happened. So the only thing we know is this stump is not smooth. It's not apparent. It could be animal, could have been torn during delivery, but it's an example that the umbilical cord stump is there, but it is jagged.
Can you tell us anything from that photograph as it would relate to answering the question of whether this was a still birth or a blood?
Nothing from that photograph. The corollary of this photograph is that section seen histologically, which was done. And so you look for, if that was the actual separation point at birth, you look for inflammation. So if you have a wound, the body tries to heal it. Same principle. There's no inflammation or microscopic evidence of reaction at that, wherever the section was taken. And I don't know where the section was taken of that umbilical cord. There's no inflammation. Inflammation would be a further supporter of a live birth.
I'd ask you to now reference your attention to State's Exhibit 13.
Yes, sir.
What is that, Doctor?
It's a an organ block sort of photograph. So this is the internal tissues that remain removed from the body. So it's sort of taking the picture in isolation. The picture's purpose is to show the defects in what's called the pericardial sac. So the forceps and it looks like two pairs of forceps maybe or scissors are holding up the pericardial sac, which is the tissue around the heart, sort of lubricates the heart as the heart's moving in fluid, showing the puncture wounds from the animal activity in that structure. But it also shows the lung, the liver, some of the neck structures, as presumably the aorta, vasculature going towards the legs is on the right side of the photograph. To me, and what the autopsy protocol doesn't describe well is what, while it's advantageous to be the pathologist doing the exam, is texture. So an aerated lung is puffy. It's sponge-like on texture. That's not described. And gross appearance of an aerated lung changes from sharp borders, collapsed in the chest cavity, to a puffy pink-red filling up the chest cavity. We've lost all that. And this picture to me does not show an aerated lung. In fact, the heart is almost bigger than the lung itself, which it's now the pointers on the heart, not by weight. The heart is clearly heavier, but that lung is sort of reduced, collapsed into the chest. We don't have a chest. The chest walls artifactually absent, right ribs are gone, but that is not a macroscopic or visual appearance of a healthy, aerated, pink, expanded lung. So if you take, for instance, the corner of drywall is normally a very sharp, angular point, but you can round that edge, bullnose or something. It's the similar aspect of a collapsed lung, atelectatic lung, and now an inflated lung. That edge or margin along the heart edge is very sharp in this photograph. In a lung that is aerated and examinable, fresher state, it has that curved margins to it, which are not described in the autopsy report. There is description in the autopsy report of a color change, which is present in this photograph, sort of near the heart on the anterior or front surfaces of the lung. There is a lighter red-pink color, which is consistent with air or gas, some expansion of the lung. Fully agree with that. But we don't have the texture, which is very important, which makes, again, the only way to evaluate the histologic appearance or microscopic appearance is in context of the gross or macros appearance. I don't think that is clearly an aerated lung, and therefore I have less confidence in the microscopic being not artifactual.
In the course of your professional endeavors, have you had an occasion to examine lungs and make the determination as to whether it was aerated or not?
Yes, sir.
On how many occasions?
Fortunately, it's not a common occurrence, so it's a dozen, 24, in that range. It's not, thankfully, 20-year practice. It's not something we do every day. So it's in the 20s, upper teens, 20s that I've actually done this exact exam.
Now, I'd like to discuss the cause of the coloration. Can you address that subject matter for this jury?
Sure. So in a unexpanded lung, the alveoli are compressed or collapsed, unexpanded. The tissues then sort of overlap one another, and they have a darker, more dense purple color because you're seeing more of the blood on itself and the tissues on top of itself. When gas expands that lung, you now create more volume, and actually more blood comes in because the surface area has changed inside the capillary, but the color is now able to appear lighter because you've expanded with gas. So as gas gets into the lung and expands it, it changes from that sort of bloody deep purple color to a more pink, salmony color as this tissue sort of separated, and the air changes the light, basically resistance to change the color.
Beyond breathing, what other way is there for gas to be introduced to the lung?
Sure. The main one is resuscitation. So actually doing CPR, so to speak, is forcing air into the lung. In a clinical sense, air can be forced into the lung in a non-clinical sense, i.e. Animal activity. So air can be brought into the lungs through the birth process. So humans are we're negative pressure breathers. So we have to create a vacuum inside our chest to bring in air. We don't force air in. So anything essentially that compresses the chest with an open airway and then allows the chest to rebound is going to create that pressure difference to bring air in when the chest expands. So the birth process can bring air in. Standing on the chest as an animal while you're chewing on the cheek can blow air in an intact airway, can create sort of a bellows effect where the other lung is collapsed and air is pushed over to the other side. That air may be air brought in artificially, or it can be created through bacteria, decomposition, that their air is present in the lung that then's forced during the animal activity onto the other side, and it potentially expands the airway in those artificial mechanisms. Bacteria can produce gases as well. And the presence of those gases can expand alveoli artificially. You can have expanded alveoli without gas even being present. They just appear expanded. And many articles now are referring to that histologic appearance more of a sign of lung maturity than they are of expansion as a reliability component.
So in connection with the coloration of the lung that is presented in this photograph, what can you tell?
It's anterior, where gas would collect, assuming if the remains are upright. It's a relatively small portion of the lung. To me, the most of the lung is a deep purple, particularly as described in the autopsy report posteriorly. It's very glistening, heavy looking. I don't have the description of the feel, which would have been helpful. But it's certainly not the appearance or color of a uniformly aerated breathing infant. There are places where there are expansion evident by that color change, yes.
And the review of that photograph, does that provide you with any basis to say that this was a live birth?
I don't believe so. I believe it adds data, which I think is actually opposite of defining it as a live birth.
Why?
Because that lung it's very collapsed, shrunken, sharp margin. It's less consistent with a live birth, in my opinion.
I now ask that you reference your attention to, I believe, Case Exhibit 13. What can you tell us about that photograph?
This photograph is sort of close up to show the defects in the pericardial sac. There is some lung, again, unfortunately covered by the scale. It does have to the date, I believe that's the date, 09, it's case number 09326. That area of the scale beneath that is sort of that salmony, more red color, where the bottom is a little darker and more purple, as described in the autopsy report. I agree with the description.
And how does that assist you in making a determination of stillbirth versus live birth?
Basically, again, it's reflecting that. So you have the heart basically from the utensil in the picture, sort of in the middle of the photograph, to the utensil on the right side of the photograph, a little lower, from the utensil to the by the scale. And the lung is only slightly larger than that. The lung is filling your chest cavity where your heart sits. It is not an expanded lung. We don't have a chest cavity. I fully admit that it could have been collapsed during that process, but that's not an expanded lung that's been aerated.
So can you hypothecate as it relates to the review of that photograph?
As to,
Hypothecate as to live birth versus stillbirth.
again, I am of the opinion that that is a data point, which is my whole opinion or basis. You need multiple data points because the histology is not 100%. I think this gives you a data point on the side of not a live birth, or at least enough variability that gives me pause on just the microscopic, because they don't line up. The microscopic and the gross are not the same appearance.
Doctor, I want to now move into the subject matter of your review, examination, and analysis of the microscopic slides in this case.
Yes, sir.
First of all, you were provided how many slides?
I don't know that I have that information with me. There's 3 sections. 3 of the slides have lung sections.
Okay, that's what I mean. So just so we're on the same page, 3 slides relating to lung tissue.
Correct.
Where did those slides come from?
The only thing I know or believe with labeling is from the autopsy. So they came from the right lung. We don't know where.
How many lobes are there in the right lung?
3.
And where in the lung, which lobe were those tissues taken from?
That is not defined in the autopsy report.
What is your criticism regarding that?
Criticism. It would have been advantageous to know, instead of assuming that it is that it's one from each lobe. For instance, we don't know where they're taken from. So if you have artificially expanded areas that changed color and the sections all came from that area, you would have expanded alveoli appearing, where the other tissues that weren't sectioned and from the macroscopic appear atelectatic or collapsed, you would miss that. I don't know what. It's an assumption to assume that they're taken from multiple places, which may be a reasonable assumption, but it's still an assumption.
As a board certified forensic pathologist, how appropriate from a scientific standpoint is it for you to rely upon assumptions?
I would not rely on assumptions to make forensic conclusions. That being said, with some of the detail or examination we do does allow for interpretation on multiple data points. So the fewer data points you have that you are making opinions about, because we don't know what actually happened, the more likely you introduce error. So in these investigations, you want and prefer to have historical information, scene information, medical records. What was the maternal care? What's the mother's health? What did the placenta look like? What did the kidneys look like? All those things that we don't have, no decomposition. And because we don't have those things, it reduces the confidence level in making opinion statements.
You had an occasion to review the 3 slides in this case.
Yes, sir.
What conclusions were you able to come to as it related to your examination?
They're certainly expanded alveoli microscopically. There's no question that that's present. There are, when I looked at it, I agree with the autopsy description. There are in the report, there are areas of atelectasis or collapse of the airways are also present. So I agree with the autopsy. I agree with the provided that there are expanded alveoli histologically, no question.
And what does that tell us as it relates to the ultimate conclusion of the question of live birth versus?
That's all it tells you, is that there's expanded alveoli histologically. And then you have to, are there other explanations for why that would have occurred? And the answer is yes.
And what is that?
Animal activity, forcing air in and out of the mouth, because there's an animal chewing on the cheek. Chest compressions, either during birth or during the animal process while the chest and airway were still intact. Decomposition, so the tissues have changed and bacteria can produce gas and that can collect in the lung tissues. Processing of the lung can create the appearance of expanded alveoli. There's some reports of the autopsy itself can produce evidence of expanded alveoli. As we talked about, stillbirth cases have expanded alveoli. Live birth have collapsed alveoli, known cases. So everything is a data point. My exam shows expanded alveoli, but I believe there are non-live birth reasons that might be present.
Doctor, I'm handing you what's been marked for purposes of identification as Defendant's Exhibit U. Can you tell us whether you've ever seen that photograph before?
Sure, I've seen this before. It's a photograph taken during the scene investigation.
And does it show a thermometer?
It does, yes.
And can you, by review of that photograph, tell us what the thermometer is showing?
You can't see where the end of the thermometer is or what it's measuring. Assume it's either in the axilla or it's in central sort of tissues. I can't tell, but you just see you see the thermometer reading itself, which is reading, looks like 50 or 49 degrees.
Handing you what's been marked for purposes of identification as Defendant's Exhibit E. Have you seen that photograph?
I have seen this photograph before.
And where is the thermometer placed?
The thermometer in this exhibit number E is in the mouth.
And gauging what?
Body temperature, so internal temperature. It's an attempt to get a marker of what the temperature of the body is.
And you've already indicated that the temperature reading is somewhere 4950.
Correct.
Okay. What significance does that have regarding decomposition in your mind?
Decomposition is always happening through autolysis, or what's called the enzyme activities. Autolysis, putrefaction is more bacterial driven decomposition. That's always happening. You can reduce it by keeping the remains cool, which slows that bacterial process. So by the marker or temperature is a marker of, are those processes slowed or not? So 49, 50 degrees is going to allow for decomposition to continue.
Doctor, for purposes of this next question, I want you to assume the following facts. that the infant was exposed to the elements from a time period of late February 27th, I believe, until its recovery March 25th. So approximately a month. And that the temperature sometimes was below freezing, sometimes around 32, and other times in the 40s. Would you expect, under those circumstances, that there would have been decomposition?
Yes, there's going to be decomposition, and the autopsy shows the brain is basically, it's not described completely, but liquefied. So the brain is not a useful exam of the brain. There is decomposition happening. It is not as much as I would expect in the internal structures, and that's probably because they're exposed and froze. So the temperatures aren't affecting it as much. It should be much greater, particularly histologically, than it is with that time window. And it's asymptomatic in the remains itself. The brain is very autolyzed and the internal organs are less autolyzed. So there is something in the environment temperature that is allowing decomposition by definition and clear with the brain, but less in the torso organs, and they're probably exposed in the shade. Something with temperature is explaining that discrepancy.
How does decomposition introduce gases internally?
They are directly produced by the action of the bacterial processes. So the reactions produce off gases. So gases are produced in that process during decomposition.
I want to discuss with you the issue one moment. Of other ways that air or gases could be introduced into the lungs of this infant. Can you please do that for us?
Sure. The main one in forensic practice is artificially through resuscitation efforts. So air being blown in physically. Air can be blown in by other mechanisms, and animal activity is one of those examples. During, feeding on the cheek, you basically essentially could be blowing air in at the same time. There are ways that air is brought in artifactually during the birthing process. As we talked about, the chest is compressed with an open airway, and then it re-expands. That can bring air in. Gases, as we just talked about, can develop inside the body, bacterial producing, and that produces air in the same fashion.
What about one source of air being introduced from, say, for example, an animal being pushed into the lungs?
Sure, that's either through the mouth, airway while feeding, or by compressing the opposite side. So clearly feeding would compress that left side, and then if there is air through decomposition in the left side, and the airway is intact, it forces right down an open airway, and now can be expanding the right side through bellows sort of mechanism, but by compressing and forcing air to the right side.
Is there any way scientifically, in this case, for anyone to opine to a reasonable degree of medical certainty where that error originated or how it originated?
My opinion is no. It's other. Yeah, I don't. I think there's too much variability in the circumstances of this case to opine that.
Tell me what significance, for example, the fact that we do not have the placenta available.
Sure. There's, as I talked about, multiple data points needed when you're evaluating. One is, could the baby survive outside of mom? Or are there risk factors of disease, congenital abnormalities, infection that would preclude live birth, or at least create risk factors for death in utero or during the birthing process? The placenta is one of those key organs, and it's how baby stays alive with mom oxygenating baby through the placenta. That's not available for exam, the placenta itself. So was there chorioamnionitis? Was there, a placental abruption? Was it over the cervix itself during delivery? Was the umbilical cord inserted wrong and then has risk factors for death? Was the cord too long? Was there accident with the cord? All those things we can't evaluate because the placenta is not available.
How about the absence of the umbilical cord?
Same things. You look for things in the diseases, abnormalities, infection, and we just can't evaluate that. And some things are merely risk factors. So these things could have happened. That lowers your confidence when evaluating the other data points.
You had an occasion to study, analyze the autopsy protocol as well as the coroner's verdict.
Yes, sir.
And it is noted that the cause of death was violence. How can a pathologist under these circumstances presented in this case generate that opinion?
Well, there's only one way that opinion can be generated. That opinion is generated because of the concealment of the remains and the opinion of that it was a live birth. So then you have the opinion of a live birth and then concealment. It is sort of a standard axiom to do that. But in this case, I don't believe you can get to that initial baseline or foundation to say it's a live birth. We do not know the cause of death. That statement is a recognition of potential, but it's also a recognition that we don't really know the cause of death, but because of actions after, it would appear concealment. But you have to first make the conclusion that it's a live birth, and I don't think that's reasonable.
And the information that was provided during the course of the interview of Gail Ritchey relative to her recollection of the birth process, what significance does that have in your evaluation of this case?
There are, I guess, two ways to be concrete about a live birth, and one is voluntary movement. And breathing is one sign of that. Swallowing is another sign of that. Heart beating or pulsing in the umbilical cord. Making some kind of noises, cooing, that kind of art. So we don't have that information. From my understanding of it, there is no indication of any movement, any sound, any sign of that would be a marker of the one true variable that confirms a live birth, which is voluntary movement.
And I note in a report that you generated, which I'll mark right now.
What do you mean, what?
Steve, what are we going to give you that one?
Would it be 8?
No. V is in Victor.
Your Honor, Defendant's Exhibit D is marked for that.
Thank you. Counsel, how much longer do you anticipate your direct? I know it's a guess, but
That would be a perfect time to take a break.
yeah. All right. Then I think we'll take a break. So, ladies and gentlemen, you heard. You have a time for a restroom break. So, when no one any longer needs to use the restroom, let a member of my staff know so we can bring you back in and finish this examination. We're adjourned. Thank you.
All right.
Sure, sorry.
Yep.
You get to take a break.
Sure. I don't know what to.
Okay. Oh, just take this.
Yeah, they provided a phone.
Thank you.
Unless the question comes up from us. On this.
Okay. Thanks, sir. Yeah, I could have been behind.
Yep. The order is.
Well, you might want to hang on to them since I'm sure it's going to be part of them.
Their point.
Yeah. Never seen it.
We're going through them again.
Yeah. I'm sure that is all doing it right.
And Nick, right? Yeah. Maybe it was Sean. Sean Hines, did you go to school with? Oh, yeah. Maggie's my boy, my girl. And so we were talking last night. And she said, I think the prosecutor went to school with my brother Sean.
Yeah, I haven't seen Sean since high school.
Yeah. You know what he's into now?
Wasn't he border?
Border Patrol, and now he went to they put him up as a firearm instructor, federal. So he does all firearm instructing of, the new cadets, so forth, to get Border Patrol. So they're in Texas, doing very well.
Oh, great. Good. Well, tell him I said.
Yeah. I'll tell her. I just wanted to verify that.
Yeah. All right. I'll back that in
More
later.
I'm trying to stay out of the way than more. Okay. And like, but. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Fine. Okay. Okay. Mhm. All right.
Please be seated. And Mr. Marine, whenever you are ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Judge. Dr. Harshberger, I handed you an exhibit that we have marked, I believe, as Defendant's Exhibit V. And do you have it in front of you?
That's the report, right?
Yeah.
I have not, I have my copy. I don't have the exhibit for some reason.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
What is that?
It's a report that I generated September 16th, 2021, letter, my thoughts in the case.
And addressed to Attorney Stephen Bradley.
Yes.
And many of your opinions that you testified here in open court are addressed in that report. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Now, doctor, you are aware that one of the tests or examinations employed by Dr. Challenger at the time that this autopsy was performed was a flotation test.
Objection.
One moment. I'll withdraw. I want to address, going backwards, the slides that you reviewed.
Yes.
Now, when reviewing those slides, did you discern the existence of any decomposition in those tissues?
Some of the sections, as I recall, had autolysis or form of decomposition. The lungs were fairly well preserved.
Now, we know that we have 3 tissue cells of the lungs themselves, or at least the one lung that remained.
Correct.
We don't know where those tissue samples came from on that lung.
Correct.
And how much of a representative sample of the lung is presented in those tissue samples?
Of the lung is a very small percentage. It's, you have small pieces of the lung itself on the slides, and then you have a very thin slice of that section on the glass slide itself. So it's ultimately a very small percentage of the total alveoli in the pig, in a lung.
Now, is it an accurate statement that there can be different pathological changes to various portions of an organ such that you would want to secure as many samples as possible?
I think in general, that's a reasonable statement. Most pathological processes, I think is the term you use, should be relatively uniform, where in this case, aeration also should be relatively uniform or not. So that's why you sample multiple areas of the lung.
In this case, was there decomposition noted in the autopsy and or the photography of the autopsy itself?
My opinion is yes, particularly of the brain. It's described as sort of I don't remember the exact term, sort of a liquefactive mass. And then in the pictures, I believe there's decomposition. And then by definition, there should be decomposition.
How reliable is an opinion regarding stillbirth versus live birth predicated on those 3 slides?
Well, my opinion is it's not reliable enough to make a reasonable degree of medical certainty opinion statement as to that question. I think there's too many variables in this case, too many other data points that are unknown, and reasons for expansion of the alveoli that are not related to breathing.
Is your opinion consistent with your experience?
Yes.
What about consistent with the medical literature on this subject matter?
I think the literature does show we as forensic pathologists as a profession have some, I don't know what the word I'm searching for, We cannot do research on these topics, so we're starting from associations, and currently it's looking at known live births versus stillbirths, and it's known that you can have both appearances, as we talked about on the slides, expanded alveoli or atelectatic or collapsed alveoli in either circumstance. It is true that there is a statistical advantage or ability with aerated or expanded alveoli that gives you a data point towards potentially expanding the alveoli with breathing, but it's not, it requires all those other data points that we don't have to make that diagnosis. So we don't have research with animal activity. We don't have research with significant decomposition. So we are just left with making associations and forming opinions to those necessary standards. And I don't think this allows that reasonable degree of medical certainty conclusion.
Now, Dr. Philo, you're familiar with Dr. Philo.
Of course, yeah.
He testified regarding his findings regarding patterns of tissue changes as it relates to the slides that you examined, both you and he examined.
Okay.
And he opined that less than 5% of the lungs showed no change, that approximately 40% of the lung tissue showed distended, and I butchered the term alveoli, and that approximately 55% I'm sorry, 40% was distended, and that approximately 55% was non-distended, open air space. What was your analysis?
Similar, I would put the atelectatic. So I think the 5% was also not what was I recall from the report, but more, the 5% was atelectatic. I'd put that at a little higher percentage, but yes, there are open air spaces. I'm not accustomed to defining hyperinflated and normal. I think it's too subtle. So I don't do that, but atelectatic versus expanded, the interpretation is reasonable. Yeah.
And based upon that interpretation, is it possible for a forensic pathologist to opine live birth versus stillbirth?
Well, clearly possible, because I think I would not, and well, that's why we're here. I would not do it, but I'm not judging that process.
Now, you had indicated that you found decomposition.
Yes, I believe it's shown in the pictures.
And Dr. Philo opined that there was no decomposition.
I mean, Dr. Field's opinion, I think there's the brain is near liquefied in the exam. I think there's evidence in the photographs of that green sort of autolytic muscle tissue present. The histology is remarkably preserved. I agree with that.
Now, I had asked you a hypothetical as it related to the infant having been exposed to the elements and what likely effect that would have on decomposition. Remember that question?
Yes, sir.
All right. I have here a document that memorializes the temperature. In February, late February, and through March.
Yes, sir. It's Exhibit L.
And if you could, by the way, have you had an occasion to review that document?
Yes.
And based upon what is presented in the changes of temperature, would that support decomposition?
Yeah. It also supports lesser decomposition there's days in here where it's -9 is one temperature, so there's freezing occurring. To me, that's supporting decomposition is the fact that it's February into March. It's happening. The body decomposes sort of being frozen, and then it decomposes very rapidly. So these temperatures, there's 46, 48, 50s for a period of stretched sunny. There's the conditions described, which we don't know if the remains are in the sun or not, 44 degrees, 51 degrees. So there are periods of time where it is in a temperature range where bacteria will continue to operate. It's also temperatures that suggest cooling, which would inhibit.
Now, in discussions I have had with you, you have discussed the fact that a significant portion of the torso has been removed, ostensibly by animal activity. What significance does that have in your analysis as it relates to making a determination of whether or not this was a live birth?
It changes, as we talked about, the variables involved or the data points involved with your analysis. So was there natural or congenital abnormalities that we can't know, which would change the risk or strength of other opinion data, i.e. the microscopic expansion of the lungs? Would that matter with no kidneys? Would that matter with a diaphragmatic hernia? Would that matter with a placental infection? Would that matter with a congenital anomaly of the brain? All those data points we don't have. Therefore, one of the analysis points is, are there congenital diseases? Are there risk factors too big for, gestational age, maternal diabetes, perhaps? Are there those risk factors which would change the analysis because it would further or add in a potential cause of death, not precluding live birth, but some conditions would preclude live birth, but changing the analysis of what that histology might mean.
So based upon what was presented at time of autopsy and the tissue samples taken and the now information about the birthing process itself, how confident would you be in generating an opinion on a reasonable degree of medical certainty regarding the ultimate question of live birth versus stillbirth?
I would not be I would not be confident enough to make that conclusion.
And is your response here today consistent with the medical literature?
Yes. And we talked about some of the research I did in the case in that article about was it a live abort. There's a quote from one of the textbooks, Dr. DeMaio, Handbook of Forensic Pathology, and the quote literally is, microscopic sections of the lung are of no help in determining if a child breathed. There is enough variability that relying on that single data point, to me, without other information, prevents reasonable medical certainty.
One moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Council, once you approach, let's talk about timing. Obviously it's one time, so the one actually, but I also know it's come from Dayton, and so here's the bit. We're good. You guys have any thoughts you want to make? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, everybody, as you're probably all painfully aware, it's lunchtime. So that was the discussion about whether to plow forward or not, but cross-examination could cause, will be well beyond the lunch hour. So I'm decided we're going to go ahead and break for lunch now. So at 5 to 12, make sure that you're back right before 1 o'clock so that we can have you back in your seats at 1 o'clock. And the same admonitions about the recess instructions. Remember them, please. We are adjourned with cross-examination.
Yes, Judge.
Well, I guess it's good afternoon, isn't it?
Good afternoon, yes.
So, Dr. Harshberger, I think this is kind of glossed over a little bit during your direct examination, but I want to ask you, you were actually paid by the defense team to review this case and come in and testify. Is that true?
That's true.
How much were you paid to testify?
I don't know I've been paid anything, and certainly it's for my time.
Okay.
I charge $350 an hour.
And is that $350 an hour to review and testify?
No, it's $350 an hour to review.
And then how much is it for testifying?
$2,500 for that 4-hour block.
And how many hours did you spend reviewing?
I don't know. I have not completely added up. It's significant time since 2019, I believe.
All right. So you got here around 10 o'clock, is that right?
Correct.
And so it's now it's all past 1.
Correct.
So today you will bill $7,500.
$2,500.
Okay, $2,500 flat to testify.
4 hours. So we're
Okay.
in another hour.
Okay, all right. Now I want to talk about what you reviewed when forming an opinion on the case.
Yes.
So you looked at the coroner's record from Geauga County / Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office.
Correct. As it was provided to me, I assume it's complete.
Yes.
Correct.
And you looked at the toxicology reports, the x-ray reports as well.
Correct.
You looked at the photos of the scene and of the body.
Correct.
And those were photos that were taken from law enforcement as well as photos that were taken by the coroner's office.
I'm not sure of I assume, but I don't know that specifically.
Okay. Well, there were photos taken outside where
Correct.
snow was visible, and then there were photos taken on a coroner's autopsy table.
Correct. In my office, my own investigators, the coroner's investigators, not law enforcement, also have a series of pictures. So I'm assuming it's law enforcement. I just don't technically know.
Okay. Fair enough. You also looked at tissue slides,
Correct.
and you looked at those tissue slides back in 2019.
Probably, yes.
Okay, and then you didn't prepare your report until September of 2021.
Correct.
Now, in your report, you referenced several statements from the birth mother of the child.
Yes.
And those statements weren't anywhere in the autopsy report, toxicology, x-rays. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say.
They weren't in the photos.
That's fair to say.
They weren't in the tissue slides.
Correct. I did neglect to put in my reviewed is the videotaped interview from law enforcement. I did review portions of that.
So in a trial for an aggravated murder case, you forgot to include something that you'd reviewed.
Yes, I did not include that I reviewed the interview videotape in my report, or I clearly referenced it in my report, but I did not list it. So yes, I neglected to. It's not in the autopsy report. Yes.
All right. Now, in an ideal situation, there's a birth that happens in a hospital, and there's a medical provider who's a witness to the birth.
Absolutely, yes. Ideal situation, yes. There's a medical provider.
In a perfect world, this birth would have taken place in a hospital.
That's what this birth, yes.
Here, not available, right?
I'm sorry, what?
Here, that's not the case.
That's not the case.
So we're going to go to the other methods to determining if the baby was born alive.
Correct.
So there are some findings that preclude a baby from being born alive. Isn't that true?
Yes.
And you talked about maceration during direct testimony.
Yes.
Can you explain for the jury what maceration means?
It's understanding. It's similar to decomposition, except it's sterile. So it's forensic pathologists learn the difference of intrauterine changes post-mortem versus external putrefactive autolytic changes.
And I've seen descriptions of maceration like the skin is bubbling and kind of peeling off from the rest of the body. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And that's not present in this case, is it?
No.
Low gestational age might be another finding that would prevent a live birth. Isn't that true?
It would demonstrate a risk that a live birth might or might not have happened.
Well, what I'm asking is a birth before 20 weeks would indicate that the baby can't be born alive.
Can't stay alive, certainly, yes. It can't exist absent the mother.
You said fetal viability is 20 weeks.
Yes.
And is there other studies that fetal viability is around 24 weeks?
Correct.
Now, that's the point at which you, as a coroner, would determine the baby could live outside the womb on its own.
20 weeks, yes.
Okay.
Obviously, that's the longer you are, the more likely you are to live outside the womb.
And you might need medical intervention, but generally around 20 weeks, the child can survive.
In this country, right. That's our definition.
When you're determining the age of a fetus, ideally, you would have medical records.
Correct.
So you would look towards medical records of the mother receiving prenatal care.
Among that would be a data point, yes.
There would be ultrasounds, measurements that doctor had taken,
Sure, yes.
and that doesn't exist here.
Correct.
So here we're looking at the body weight of the child,
Correct.
as well as examining the organs.
Correct.
Now you based your opinion on whether this was a full-term child based on the stated weight of 2,102 grams. Is that right?
Partially, yes. And the organ exam.
Now, you didn't give an estimate of how much the infant would have weighed with all the limbs and organs present.
Correct.
So the 2,102 grams doesn't take into account the leg that's missing,
Correct.
or the arm,
Correct.
or the other organs.
Correct.
And you'd agree with me that if those had been present, the baby would have weighed over that 2,102 grams.
I do agree with that.
Okay. So based on the approximately 2,100 gram weight, you estimated that the baby was either 31 or 35 weeks old.
Yes, but the sentence before that says there's a wonderfully broad variability and we don't have all the tissue. Yeah.
And so if the baby was 31 weeks old, the baby would have been in the 90th percentile for weight. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
And if the baby were 35 weeks old, it would have been in the 10th percentile.
Correct, at the weight given in the autopsy report.
And both of those estimations, 31 weeks and 35 weeks, are well beyond that fetal viability of 20 weeks.
Correct.
Another indication that the baby was incompatible with life or incompatible with a live birth would be some lethal malformation.
True.
And you didn't find that here.
Correct.
So there are some findings that indicate that there could be birth complications. Isn't that true?
Yes.
One of them is meconium.
Yes.
Can you explain for the members of the jury what that is?
Sure. It's basically GI contents in a baby that under stress gets excreted, and then since the baby's basically bringing in the amniotic fluid, it's brought in some in the lungs, so you can see it microscopically. It is it is a sign of distress to the fetus.
So essentially, it's the baby breathing in its own fecal matter.
Correct.
Or poop.
Correct.
And that would be evidenced by dark staining of the skin or the fingernails. Isn't that true?
That is true.
And that's not present here.
That's not present here.
There would also be, you would also look for signs of birth trauma.
Correct.
Such as, and I might be butchering this pronunciation, but precipitate labor.
Yes.
And that is when there's an unusually fast labor with essentially an explosion of the fetus outside of the vagina.
Rapid delivery, yes.
And if that happens in close proximity to a surface, that could cause blunt force trauma to the fetus.
Correct.
And that's usually characterized by skull fractures.
Could have a skull fracture by more commonly bleeding around the brain.
But you didn't find a skull fracture or bleeding around the brain here.
Correct.
Also, I'm definitely going to butcher this pronunciation. Occipital osteodiastasis?
Yes, diastasis.
Diastasis?
Separating of the sutures.
And that's the occipital bone at the base of the skull?
Yes.
And that there were no fractures or separation there?
Correct. As well as on X-ray. The X-ray report specifically says there is not.
So the X-ray confirmed that was not
Correct.
a potential birth complication. Oh, I want to talk to you about stillbirth specifically. It is not your opinion that a stillbirth definitely occurred here. Is that right?
That's right.
Now, in comparison to other countries in the world, the United States has a fairly low percentage of stillbirths. Isn't that right?
Yes, if you qualify that with other countries being third world, yes.
I believe Australia and the United States have the lowest percentage of stillbirths.
Don't know the answer to that, but it makes reasonable sense in advanced healthcare systems.
All right, there have actually been studies and articles that you cited that the United States experiences stillbirths in only 3 out of every 1,000 births.
Correct.
Now I want to talk to you specifically about the risk factors for stillbirths. You would want to know fetal conditions.
Yes.
So looking for lethal malformations.
Correct.
You didn't find any of those.
True, but we're missing a significant portion.
You didn't find any evidence of chromosomal or genetic disease.
Fair, but we're also having an autolyzed brain and missing organs.
You didn't find any structural abnormalities outside of the obvious animal activity.
Which is significant, yes, but that is a fair statement.
And it's fair to say that while there are factors related to the placenta, you didn't have that information.
That's fair to say.
Okay. All right, so a stillbirth is more likely if the child's mother is under 15 years old.
Yes,
And a stillbirth is also more likely if the mother is over 35 years old.
probably. Yeah. I'm not an obstetrician, but
It's more likely if the mother smoked.
yes,
Stillbirth's more likely if there's documented medical history of a stillbirth
yes,
or documented history of an infant death within the first year of life.
I believe
Or
so. Yeah.
within the
Yeah.
first week, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Stillbirth is more likely if the mother never seeks medical care while she's pregnant.
correct.
Stillbirth is more likely if the mother abused alcohol or drugs.
Yes,
Stillbirth is more likely if it's a multiple pregnancy, meaning pregnant with twins or higher number of infants.
yes, placental issues. Yes.
And it's more likely if the mother's diabetic
Correct.
or if the mother develops gestational diabetes.
Correct.
And it's more likely if there's some maternal infection.
Absolutely.
And that, like COVID or Zika virus, might be an infection that could cause a stillbirth.
Fair. Yes. Which we have no way to examine, particularly in the placenta.
Now I want to talk to you about neonaticide.
Yes.
Now that is the deliberate killing of an infant within the first 24 hours
Correct.
of life.
Correct.
And usually, based on research, that neonaticide is committed by the child's mother.
That would be most common. Yes.
Now determining whether it's neonaticide or a stillbirth, you're going to look towards factors that determine whether or not the child was born alive.
First, yes.
Okay.
Foundational issue. Yeah.
Yes. So you mentioned healing of the umbilical stump.
Correct.
And now changes to the umbilical cord, or the umbilical stump, are only going to be visible to the naked eye after 24 to 48 hours after birth.
I don't understand the question.
Okay, so you or I, looking at an umbilical cord without any microscope, wouldn't be able to see any healing on the umbilical cord that's been cut or torn until 24 to 48 hours after birth.
Generally, that's a true statement. There are research implications now with special staining, immunohistochemical staining of some markers that is ongoing, but that's generally a true statement.
Now, scientists with a microscope, with access to that chemical staining, they may be able to see changes as a result of healing sooner than that 24 to 48 hours.
Correct.
Is that right? They might be able to see it as soon as 3 hours
Correct.
after birth.
That's the research areas now. Yeah.
But if the child was killed within minutes of birth, you wouldn't see any healing to the umbilical cord stump, would you?
Don't know, because that's still an area of research of when that develops, when it happens. There is some new research about inflammation of the umbilical cord actually occurring still in utero. So don't know the answer to that. It's reasonable with the state of knowledge now that that's a correct statement.
Now, I'm going to ask this because I didn't fully understand. I believe that the members of the jury definitely didn't understand.
Objection as to what the jury understands and not.
Overruled.
Doctor, a baby can survive outside the womb with the placenta and the umbilical cord still attached.
Yes,
It doesn't need to be cut immediately after birth.
correct.
In fact, a baby could die and then the umbilical cord is cut or torn, and then you'd have no evidence of healing.
Correct.
You also talked about food in the stomach or food in the lungs,
Stomach.
or food in the stomach. That would assume that the mother, in fact, fed the child.
The child was fed. The mother, I don't. Right.
Okay. You would agree with me that if a child is never fed and is killed minutes after birth, there would never be any food in the lung or food in the stomach.
Agreed.
Now, there was a lot of talk about decomposition during your direct testimony. You're not able to give a definitive date of death, are you?
No.
It's not your opinion that the baby was born, died, birthed in February of 1993, is it?
I think that is consistent with statements, but pathologically or anatomically, you can't make that distinction.
So you don't know when the child was birthed?
My opinion would be that it's a month by statements, but by pathological or anatomy, you can't make that distinction.
Okay, so based on the pathology and the anatomy, you don't know.
Correct.
You also don't know, based on pathology and anatomy, where the child was birthed.
That's true, yes.
Now, you stated there was actually less decomposition than you'd expect.
True, and based on the histology. The lung slides are relatively well preserved, which is, I'm surprised, actually.
But there was decomposition to other parts of the body,
In my opinion, yes.
the muscles.
The muscles and the brain.
Now, you were shown a photo. You have the photo?
Yes,
Shown?
I do.
All right. So looking at Defendant's Exhibit G and Defendant's Exhibit E.
Yes.
So that shows a thermometer in the baby's mouth and then the reading of that thermometer.
It shows Exhibit E is in the mouth, and then Exhibit G has the reading, but it appears that the thermometer has been moved. It may just be, this is the photo where it was, and then this is the reading so you can see it. I don't know that.
All right, now, this is back in 1993. It was using one of those old school thermometers.
It looks like an old school thermometer, yes.
Okay, so now we have these digital thermometers that will beep when the thermometer's done. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
One of those old school thermometers, it's not going to indicate that, is it?
It's not gonna, well, no, there's no indication of it's done reading the temperature correctly.
Okay. So you don't know where in the process that thermometer was when that photograph was taken.
I don't know. So, yes, I don't know if the thermometer was being placed there for 10 seconds or 15 minutes. Nor
Now-
multiple, you really need multiple measurements to make any accurate determination.
Say, for example, a coroner's investigator had that thermometer in his pocket,
Yes.
and it was warm because it was close to his body and getting some of his body heat.
Okay.
Okay? And then he took it out of his pocket and put it immediately in the infant's mouth.
Okay.
Wouldn't that impact the temperature that was read?
If the thermometer already was reading 50 degrees and placed there momentarily, yes, it wouldn't have time to re-equilibrate to the actual temperature of the baby yet.
You were also asked about the cause of death being undetermined violence. Is that right?
I'm sorry, I was distracted for a moment in my head, so just one more time.
It's okay. You were also asked about the cause of death for
Yes.
infant Doe being undetermined violent. Undetermined violent means.
Yes.
Now, and you said that you can't get there.
I
Is that
cannot
right?
get there.
Yes. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about suffocation.
Yes.
Okay? So, generally when we think of suffocation, we think of someone suffocating another person with an object, like a pillow.
Sure. Suffocation is the external obstruction of the airway.
And when someone is suffocated with a pillow, there's going to be some signs on the body that occurred. Is that fair to say? Or that there could be?
Yes, that's fair to say.
There could be bruising from the pressure.
Particularly with someone with teeth and active, so non-obtunded, non-intoxicated person.
Now, when a bag is used, that's not the case, is it?
It would depend, obviously, on how the bag was used, but yes, the theory being just covering or eliminating oxygen capacity by a bag, plastic over the mouth and nose, would change the oxygen concentrations and there suffocate without those signs of trauma yet.
If a baby was placed in a bag, they would then be suffocated.
Correct.
And difficult to breathe given the limited oxygen in the bag and eventually run out of air.
Yes.
And there would be no physical injuries visible on the child consistent with that.
If that's the hypothetical, yes, there would be no injury.
And we talked about, or you talked about on direct, the slides that you reviewed.
Yes.
And the expansion of air that needs to happen when a child breathes.
The expansion of the alveoli?
Yes. And you have reviewed Dr. Philo's report and watched him testify at another hearing, is that right?
That's right.
And you don't disagree with his findings in the slides.
I don't. I have slightly different findings, but I don't. His findings are his findings.
Okay. You said that that 5% of the non-expanded airspaces, you wouldn't disagree with that.
I would call it more than 5%, but yes. But that's the only part I disagree with. There are expanded alveoli. I think there's more atelectasis than 5%.
And what is that atelectasis?
Collapsed airspace.
You also don't disagree that there is absolutely no evidence of decomposition in the lungs.
Microscopically, the lungs are relatively well preserved yet.
Yes. Yes. You agree with Dr. Philo's findings that based on those review of the microscope slides, there's no evidence of decomposition in the lungs.
Of the lung, yes.
Now there's decomposition in other areas of the body.
Correct.
Now it's important to consider the lung morphology, or more simple terms, the appearance of the lung.
Grossly or microscopically or both?
Both.
It's important to consider both.
And grossly, we're looking at the color. Is that fair to say?
It's one of the variables we're looking at.
And we're also looking at texture.
Yes.
But the color of a live-born infant is generally, in their lungs, is going to be that lighter, more salmony pink color.
Yes.
And those
assuming
are
aeration, yes.
Those are the aerated.
Expansion.
The aerated, the expanded lungs.
Correct.
And the stillborn infants who haven't breathed are generally going to have that darker, purpley color that's more in line with the liver.
Among other things, yes.
Now, a child is going to need multiple breaths to fully expand their lungs. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
The first breath, not going to fully expand the lungs.
Correct.
And in order for the lungs to be fully aerated or inflated, it's going to need more time breathing.
Yes, and deeper breathing.
More time and deeper breathing. So if a child's killed minutes, seconds after birth, those lungs wouldn't be fully aerated or fully inflated.
True.
Okay, I can have a moment, Judge.
Certainly.
Judge, I have no further questions at this time.
Okay, thank you. Redirect.
Doctor,
Yes, sir.
was this child suffocated?
I have no way of knowing that. You have to get to a live birth. I don't think you can get to a live birth. And if you can't get to a live birth, you can't suffocate a body.
And the prosecutor asked you a question about you agree with Dr. Philo that there were no signs of decomposition in the tissues that you examined of the lungs, correct?
On the microscopic slide.
Right. And so tell me, and actually don't tell me anything, tell the jury, how much of the lung was preserved from a tissue standpoint that would permit you to make the determination as to whether or not there was decomposition?
They're very small portions of the lung. First of all, you're 50%, right? The whole left lung is missing, so you only have the right lung, and then you only have 3 pieces of that lung on the glass slides. Ultimately, it's a very small percentage of total lung tissue that would have been present and that are preserved. It is well preserved on the slide, but it's a very small portion, which immediately next door may have had a different appearance.
And again, I think you had indicated in your earlier testimony today that the medical documentation, the research, the writings that medical doctors rely upon have shown that there has been aeration with a stillbirth and there has been deflation with a live birth.
I would use the term expansion, the appearance histologically of aeration. So the alveoli are expanded in both those cases, and they're collapsed, known to be seen collapsed histologically in known live births. Yes.
And you've talked about points of consideration that a objective pathologist would employ when answering the question of was this a live birth, right?
Yes.
And now the prosecutor asked you about these things that were absent, organs and other information that may have been of assistance. Based upon what you have been presented in this case, is there anything other than the 3 slides of a tiny portion of the remaining lung that is a point of consideration?
The only other point of consideration is the size being above that 20 weeks. So gestationally, the fetus was capable of sustaining life outside the womb based on age, but the only determination of a live birth or the marker of that, which is voluntary movement or breathing, is those lung slides.
Doctor, you are the chief forensic officer for the Ohio State Coroners Association. Is that right?
Yes.
Not to belabor the point, but the top guy of that organization.
No, there's an executive director, and I serve with him. It is not, well, yes, I'm not the top guy. There's an executive director and a
Okay.
board. I answer to a board. There's a 9-member board, I think, right now.
Was this a live birth?
In my opinion, you cannot make that determination to a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Is there anything beyond those slides other than the size of the infant that is a point of reference that would assist a pathologist?
No, that's the lung histology is the marker being relied on.
Anything else?
Not in my opinion.
Now, the prosecutor asked you a question about food in the stomach. What significance would that have in rendering an answer to a question as to whether something was a live birth?
It's a secondary marker to voluntary muscle action. So to swallow, it takes a coordinated reaction. So a baby having ingested food would be proof, or at least another marker to add to the category of the baby was alive.
Prosecutor asked you a question about when was the date of birth and where was the place of birth, and your response is,
I don't know.
and what significance would that have in making a determination as to whether or not this was a live birth?
The only significance that comes to mind is being able to evaluate a scene. So we talked about precipitous delivery. I can't say it either. Some of those markers would be present at a scene. It'd be always good to have a scene evaluation. But in this case, we're literally left with the lung histology.
And the prosecutor asked you a question about a thermometer. If a thermometer was, for example, placed in the pocket of a investigator and then ultimately immediately placed in the mouth of the infant in this case and then immediately pulled out, I think your response was the thermometer would really show, or the thermometer reading would really show nothing.
It wouldn't be an accurate representation of the baby's core temperature.
Okay, let's talk about what's in evidence. Do you know whether or not, as the prosecutor asked you, whether or not the thermometer was in the officer's coat pocket?
I do not know.
Do you know how long the officer placed that thermometer in the baby's mouth?
I do not know.
Do you know what the duration was in waiting for there to be a reading?
I do not know.
So what significance do those questions have in this room?
Do not know.
Or would the answer be none?
The answer, I don't know that that's an answer I can provide.
Okay. Now, the prosecutor asked you about you getting paid.
Yes.
Is this how you make a living?
No.
When you are testifying on behalf of the state of Ohio as the Montgomery County coroner and on behalf of maybe 40 other county prosecutors' offices, do you get paid? I mean, are you getting a salary?
I am, yes.
Do you know whether or not, for example, in Geauga County, pathologists get paid?
My understanding they'd be on salary, just like I would be.
And so when you, as a coroner, testify in a court of law, are you being paid?
Yes.
Is there anything wrong, unethical, inappropriate, illegal, immoral with you charging a fee for your services?
No.
Have you ever had your house painted?
Yes.
Do the painters get paid?
Yes.
What about a plumber? Does the plumber get paid?
A lot, yes.
Is there any significance whatsoever with your being paid in this case and having it jade your opinions?
No. No, My opinions are my opinions. My time is also my time. So yes, there's a fee that comes along with that. It's a Saturday. Typically, I'm giving up other work, so I'm not today. But it does not change the testimony I provide. My time is compensated.
Doctor, I think this is the end of my questioning of you, and safe travels back to Dayton.
Thank you, sir.
No further questions, Judge.
Okay, thank you. You may step down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge.
Oh, okay. All right.
Can we briefly approach Judge?
Yes. I just did. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, yesterday, you remember I read you a stipulation that the parties have made, so I have further stipulations now to recite to you. The parties hereby agree and stipulate to the following facts. Gail Ritchey was employed by David Cantor and Mary Ellen McNulty as a full-time nanny for their 2 children in their home located in Shaker Heights, Geauga County, Ohio. The children, a boy and a girl, were approximately ages 7 and 4 1/2 at the time she began her employment. Gail worked for the family for almost 5 years, beginning in approximately July 1992 through approximately May 1997. Gail would typically work Monday through Friday from 7 a.m. till 6 p.m. Had they testified, Mr. Cantor and Ms. McNulty would have stated they saw Gail on a daily basis, Monday through Friday, during this time period and observed no noticeable physical change in Gail consistent with her being pregnant, and had no idea that she was in fact pregnant during the period of July 1992 to February 1993. Finally, defendants' exhibits M through P fairly depict the interior of the kitchen and the bathroom located off the kitchen as it appeared in March 1993. Here's the next stipulation. The parties hereby agree and stipulate to the following facts. Gail Ritchey was living at her parents, Harvey and Nancy, at their home in Lyndhurst, Ohio, during the period to include July 1992 through February 1993. Gail's younger sister, also named Nancy, lived with the family as well. Had they testified, Gail's mother and sister would have stated that they saw Gail on a daily basis during this time period and observed no noticeable physical change in Gail consistent with her being pregnant, and had no idea that she was in fact pregnant. That's the end of the stipulations. Counsel, where do we go next?
Judge, subject to the admission of our exhibits, we have no further witnesses at this time, and we would respectfully rest.
Okay, thank you. Any objections to the exhibits, the motion? Because if there are, I think what I'll do is I'll excuse the jury and we can proceed
I don't know
further.
if there will be any objections, but I think we should probably go over them just off the record.
I agree.
Okay.
Or, I'm sorry, not outside the presence.
Okay, so you get a break. We'll take care of these details. And remember not to discuss the case amongst yourselves. We're adjourned.
Exhibits on the bench, so you can go through them all. Let me check again all your stuff.
Well, we have some more too.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Please be seated. So, Mr. Bradley, why don't you list the exhibits that you are offering for admission?
Just take one and get them in order.
Sure.
that's right, yeah. Judge, we have no objection to the exhibits that Mr. Bradley has just shown.
Okay, why don't you just read off the numbers?
So we have Defendant's Exhibit A, Defendant's Exhibit B, C, and D, all of which are brochures and/or literature from the Camp Koinonia retreat that was held from February 26th to February 28th of 1993. We have Exhibits E and G, which were the photographs of the thermometer. Then we have Exhibit J, which is a scene at the Sidley Road area on March 25th. We have Exhibit I, which is just another photograph of the Sidley Road area on March 25th. We have Exhibit L, which is actually a two-sided, single document, but two-sided, that is the climatological records. Then we have Exhibits M, N, O, and P, which are the photographs of the interior of the Cantor residence, and more specifically the kitchen area and the bathroom area off the kitchen. And then photographs Q, R, S, T, and U are basically various photographs of
Good thing you're tall.
of Gail, Ritchey, and her family that were referenced in our opening slide deck. And then we have Exhibit V, as in Victor, that is Dr. Harshbarger's report, and consistent with our discussions in chambers and with the prosecutor, we intend to replace this report with a redacted version, consistent with the court's previous rulings, but we've otherwise discussed that with counsel and have an agreement and understand, and I'll make sure that before this exhibit goes back to the jury, it's been appropriately redacted and reviewed by the
Great.
prosecutor. We would respectfully move the court to admit all of these exhibits.
Okay, and noting that there's been no objection to him, I do admit them.
Could we briefly approach again?
Yes. folks, we are going to adjourn. Council's going to join me in chambers with court reporter, and we'll accomplish some further discussions back there. And hopefully it won't be very long, and then, well, we got to discuss whether or not you're putting on any rebuttal or not. So we're adjourned for that.
All right.
Please be seated. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as you heard, the defendant has rested, and therefore the state has the opportunity, if they so choose, to present a rebuttal witness, and they are going to present a rebuttal witness. So, Ms. Keating, are you going to handle this?
Yes, Judge. The state recalls Dr. Joseph Philo. All right, Dr. Philo, I'm handing you State's Exhibit 8.
Yeah. We don't have to re-swear, I don't believe. You've already been sworn in, Doctor, so please.
I agree.
All right, Dr. Philo. I'm going to direct you to the part of the autopsy report that deals with the adrenal glands. And you were here when Dr. Harshberger testified, is that true?
Yes,
And did you hear him state that the adrenal glands were not present?
that's what he said, yes.
Were the adrenal glands present in the body?
Yes,
How do you know?
because there's microscopic tissues that identified them.
Is there a statement or a sentence in the autopsy report that says adrenal glands were not identified?
Correct, that's what it states.
What does that mean?
It means that they were not identified in that Dr. Challoner was not able to discern by looking at the tissues if an adrenal gland was there or not. However, it was confirmed under microscopy that some of the tissues that were submitted did indeed have adrenal glands. So not identified means he could not find them. It does not mean they were not there.
So it doesn't mean that they didn't exist.
That's right.
Now, did you hear Dr. Harshberger talk about, given that there were missing organs in the torso, that would have been difficult for him to conclude that there was a live birth?
Yes.
What organs are necessary for there to be a live birth?
The heart, the lungs, and the brain.
And as long as those three organs are present, can the infant survive outside the womb?
Yes.
Now you heard Dr. Harshberger testify about an animal standing on the infant's chest.
I did.
Can you explain what, if any, effect that had on your opinion?
It has no effect on my opinion, and the reason for that is I don't know what animal, the size, and anytime there's pressure on the chest, the ribs are designed to hold, to protect the internal organs. So, again, I mean, if it was a large animal, which there's no evidence based on the injuries on the body that this was a large animal. When I say large, like a bear, I don't think there's any significance in that statement that he had.
And you heard Dr. Harshberger testify about decomposition of the brain.
Yes.
Did the fact that the brain had experienced decomposition, did that have any effect on your opinion?
It did not.
If I may have a moment, Judge.
Yes.
Doctor, if the brain, as it was at the autopsy, was so decomposed that it was essentially liquefied, how do you know that it was a functioning brain at birth?
Based on the initial description of the brain, there's no evidence of an epidural, subdural, or subarachnoid hemorrhage. That's bleeding on the surface of the brain or on the membrane that separates the skull bones from the brain itself. So there's no like a stroke or trauma associated with the brain, and there was no birth defects with that would have been initially seen, or malformations that Dr. Challoner did not comment on.
All right, no further questions.
One moment. We have no questions.
Thank you. Dr. Field, thank you again, and you are excused.
You're welcome.
Anything further from the state?
No, Judge.
Okay. Well, in that case, we've come to the end of the presentation of the evidence by both sides. So what remains to be done would be closing arguments by counsel to you, and then I will issue you further instructions to help not only define further the crimes being charged and the elements, but in addition, how to kind of manage and function as a jury, some suggestions for you and instructions for you. So, given the fact that it's a Saturday, and given the fact that we're now approaching 2:30, I've made a determination that the best way to proceed is to have you come back Monday morning, and everything will unfold then, and it would be likely, not that anything can happen unpredictable, but it's going to be likely that you'll then be given the case for consideration on Monday at some point. So, counsel, anything else you want to address before the jury's excused?
On behalf of the defense.
Okay, then you are excused, and again, you got a whole day now to resist temptation and research and communications, and try and relax and have a good Sunday. Thank you for your extra efforts.
What time?
Oh, Monday? What time? Excellent question. Well, we haven't all discussed this, but I think it would be appropriate to begin, have you come into the courtroom as close to 8:30 as possible, so please be here starting at 8 and no later, probably than 8:15. Okay. Thank you. We told you that yesterday, and then it's switched up on you, so check your phone messages just in case there's anything different. There shouldn't be, but just in
Call the
case.
recording.
Call the recording, yeah. If it's changed, you'll hear it there. Okay, please be seated. I'm prepared to address the Rule 20, pending Rule 29 motion for acquittal. I am denying the motion on both grounds that were offered. I do believe that reasonable minds could come to different conclusions as to whether or not the state has proven beyond reasonable doubt the essential elements of the charges. Secondly, as to venue, I've determined that venue is proper given the parameter of the statute. And I do this because I believe that it couldn't be determined with reasonable certainty the site of the alleged crime. The only evidence is the interview with the police that wasn't sworn testimony, and there's been no corroborating evidence presented that it definitively happened in Shaker Heights. So I believe that the state had no realistic option but to bring the charges in Geauga County as the statute would permit. So I think we've addressed everything we need to address for today. So
Just one minor point, Judge. In light of that ruling, sometime in the last several hours, we had filed a supplement to our proposed jury instructions, somewhat in anticipation of that particular ruling. I don't think, to be fair, I don't think they've had the opportunity to even look at it, but we do propose a series of jury interrogatories that would address that question regarding the venue issue. It speaks for itself. I just want to bring that to your attention.
okay, I haven't seen those yet.
It was filed while we were in open court.
Okay.
I just want to alert you to that.
All right, so I certainly will take a look at that. Just so you know, at this stage, absent some changes that you might suggest, I am proposing to use as the jury instructions the ones submitted by the state, with the exception that I'm referring not to Geauga's child, but to baby boy Doe. Okay, then we are set for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
That's all, folks. So we have a pleasant weekend.
Thank you, you too.
Yeah, so
But you will call me and remind me.
No worries. Yeah, I'm usually it's always you. It is always me. Thank you.
all right, take care.
Bye. Yes, all of them. Did you want to see? Here, this is the stuff. Oh, you did get theirs? 1-2-15. Then that's what I got. That's right. Just that's what I get that. Okay, yeah, good.
I did only
And not necessarily in that order.
Has that expressed that? Show me a check. It would be good to know how.
All right, I gotta get
Anita.
It sounds good.
I'm frustrated.
Okay, no time limits on closing arguments.
Will you just, I just sent Judge
Let's make sure he got it.
supplemental rights.
Right to his email. Did he give it to you? Can you check your email and you got?
Well,
Because I know
sounds like
Rich is looking at it. Hang on, Steve. We'll look right now.
Yep.
Steve, are you ready? Why not?
Well, I'm waiting, first of all, make sure that the judge got this.
We're going
2:27 p.m. today. Supplemental. That's yours. Okay. Yep. We're all set. Oops. Yeah. We're good, and there is no time limitation and close.
Yes.
Well, you guys get like 3 minutes, and you get 3 hours.
Under Judge Burke, 20, doesn't matter what the case is, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Well,
And then rebuttal, you would
Nick,
get.
we were so freaked out when we tried that case and
I
that the
just can't.
conclusion
Yeah,
of
I'm so
opening
sorry.
statement, which
If
really
I had gotten it
only
last night, I would have
3
worked on it
minutes
today
long,
if I wasn't here.
Steve said,
I really would
I think I
have.
said, well, conclusion on this case, something I said, but I have something.
we're asking the answer.
I didn't realize it until this morning.
I thought he was going to come over the method sheet
Could you though?
and start kicking Stephen there.
Yeah.
Oh, she would go.
Okay, just one
And we're going to go get doctors. I've never seen anything like it.
See, I grew up on the
Okay.
land, so now I know my open.
Yeah.